Hi there, I'm Haruka. Recently, I made a big ol' explainer video on what hockey is and how it works. While working on this video, I wanted to have a bit of a history lesson on hockey like I did in the baseball video. But then, as it turns out, the history of hockey is very weird and interesting and needed to be its own video. So here is that video. We start in the 14th century, where there was actually evidence of hockey-like games. Actually, most of the mention of hockey from this time comes from the game being forbidden for some reason. Also, most of these were the field hockey variations, though there is still plenty of evidence for ice hockey in Scotland, Scandinavia, and in areas around the Netherlands and Belgium. Hell, there's even evidence of a completely separate hockey-like game among some First Nations people in Canada that they'd been playing long before colonization. Clearly, what we've learned here is that hockey is just the natural evolution of mankind, or at least any civilization living around water that freezes. We're going to have to jump ahead now to the actual modern establishment of hockey in Montreal in the late 1870s. The first game was on March 3rd, 1875 and ended in a fight when a rival skating gang, club, came to protect their turf in the Victoria skating rink. I mentioned this in my video on fighting as well. The game actually had 9 players on each side and the goals were absolutely massive compared to the modern dimensions. So, very different. Like with any sport prior to the 20th century, there were constantly competing sets of rules, usually created by rich white guys who did it because they wanted to control the game themselves. While the first game had 9 players, that was lowered to 7 later. That extra vestigial player is a rover, which worked sort of like a midfielder in soccer, a designated offensive defender. In 1888, Lord Stanley of Preston, the Governor General of Canada at the time, don't ask me what that title means, I couldn't find any real meaning in it, went to a hockey game and decided that it was fun. So he decided to make a trophy for the best team in Canada. It was called the Stanley Cup, and it was introduced in 1893 for the Amateur Hockey Association of Canada. Also of note, Stanley's kids were all deeply involved in hockey, and his daughter Isabel was one of the first women to ever play hockey. So the NWHL trophy is known as the Isabel Cup, though it was created 50 years after her death. Anyway, by 1896, hockey had spread from the colleges in Canada to the colleges in America, mostly Ivy League schools, although that's just kind of how sports worked back then. It also made it to Europe when Lord Stanley's sons beat a team that apparently had future kings Edward VIII and George V in the lineup. The first pro league was actually not the NHL, it was the NHA. It was around when the rover position was finally dropped in 1910 and established 3 20-minute periods and pretty much all of the most common penalties. But it ended up failing because a bunch of owners got annoyed at one man, an act that would lead to probably the greatest series of events I have ever heard about. That man was Toronto owner Eddie Livingston, who would hold a grudge against the NHL and its owners until his death. So basically, the National Hockey League was only really created to be a placeholder league while they all waited for Livingston to be removed from the NHA. This was the Montreal Canadiens, Montreal Wanderers, and the Ottawa Senators who created this temporary league in 1917. Quick side note, these Ottawa Senators aren't the current Ottawa Senators. The old Sens went defunct in 1934, but they'll be back in the 90s, just wait. Anyway, the NHA had decided in its final owners meeting that Livingston would be ordered to sell the Toronto Blue Shirts, but he refused. So they just created the NHL and replaced him with the Toronto Arenas. So in response, Eddie would sue the NHL for stealing his franchise for half a decade until finally the Ontario Supreme Court ruled in 1923 that Toronto Arenas owner Charlie Query owed Livingston $100,000. This converts to a little under 1.5 million in current Canadian dollars. Query quickly realized that he could not pay this money and literally pushed all the debt onto his wife, making her the sole owner of the Toronto St. Patrick's because the team was having a bit of an identity crisis along with this. Due to this weird financial tactic, his wife became the first woman to be the sole owner of an NHL team only 6 years or so into the league's existence. Anyway, the appeals court lowered the debt down to $10,000, which is still about $150,000 today, but Livingston wasn't having any of it and appealed the appeal. By 1927, the Queries realized that they were screwed and they needed to get out now. So they sold the team to Conn Smythe, a man who ran a sand and gravel company with Frank Selk, the man who coached a hockey team that Smythe beat back when he was still in college. Smythe came in with a plan to not only clear the team's debts, but to also build the newly renamed Toronto Maple Leafs into a contender. This story is about to get even weirder. So this is before trades were a normal thing and it was much more like the transfer system in modern soccer. Smythe wants this guy, King Clancy, from the Senators. The Senators are having their own financial troubles because this is the height of the Great Depression, so they really need to get money from this transfer and set a pretty high price on Clancy. So Smythe does what any normal rich guy does and tries to earn the extra money through gambling. Not only is Smythe a sand and gravel man and a well-known hockey owner, he's also a horse breeder. So he places his own horse, Rare Jewel, into a race that just so happened to be created in commemoration of the coronation of one of the previously mentioned kings who played hockey in the 1896 exhibition, King Edward VIII. Rare Jewel is given 107-to-1 odds in this race by the time she's set at the gates. This horse is legit trash and has placed last in every single other race that she has been in. But Smythe not only places his own bets, he's getting the rest of his ownership group to place bets on her. And somehow, even up against a horse who would eventually go on to win the Canadian equivalent of the Kentucky Derby, Rare Jewel won. With the odds set, a $1 bet on Rare Jewel paid out $107. Smythe got over $10,000 from that single race, and Rare Jewel never won another race again. And so, Smythe bought Clancy from the Sens and then did something even more stupid. Smythe decided in the middle of the Great Depression that he wanted to build a massive arena. The Maple Leaf Gardens somehow not only got built, but was a successful hockey venue. He even made a deal with CNR Radio to create what would eventually become Hockey Night in Canada. Alright, before I move on from this era of hockey, I need to explain how the All-Star Game was created. It all started when Toronto Maple Leaf Ace Bailey was almost brutally murdered on the ice. He got flipped around back in the days when they had pretty much no equipment and they were giving him last rites while he was still on the ice after shattering his skull. But somehow he survived after extensive surgery in the hospital. But the medical bills were a lot, so the Leafs decided to hold a fundraiser exhibition against a team of all-stars from the rest of the league. Bailey's number 6 became the first retired number in NHL history, and the All-Star Game became a tradition. Here we are now at the original 6. After a ton of teams had to drop out of the league due to financial reasons, by the time the 40s came around, there were only 6 NHL teams. These were the Boston Bruins, Chicago Blackhawks, Detroit Red Wings, Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers, and Toronto Maple Leafs. This would pretty much be the league for the next couple decades. And in terms of who the best was, the Stanley Cup usually stayed put whenever it ended up going somewhere. The Leafs, Red Wings, Canadiens, and the Leafs again pretty much held it for 5 years before passing it off to someone else. Let's get into some random fun stuff from this era though. Gordie Howe is probably the greatest overall hockey player of all time. He started playing in 1946 and would end up playing until 1980 when he retired for the Hartford Whalers at age 52 after racking up 15 goals, 26 assists, and 42 penalty minutes in his final season. The reason I mentioned penalty minutes is because he wasn't just a goal scorer. He was an incredibly physical player who spawned his own phrase, the Gordie Howe hat trick. That's when you get a goal, an assist, and a fight in the same game. Howe dominated hockey for decades and then kept playing. He finished his career with 6 MVP awards, 23 All-Star selections, 4 Stanley Cups, and retired twice while still holding the lead in the all-time goal-scoring record. Another player of note was Willie O'Ree, who in 1958 became the first black player in the NHL. O'Ree didn't really have the same level of talent in his sport, but he's widely regarded as the Jackie Robinson of hockey for having broken the color barrier at the very least. Unfortunately, the racism he faced in the late 50s is still experienced by a concerning amount of black players in the modern NHL. Another big thing to talk about in this time period is the evolution of equipment. The first goalie to ever wear a mask was back in the 30s, but he hated wearing that mask. The guy who didn't hate wearing a mask was Jacques Plante, who developed a new mask after breaking both cheekbones during a practice. His coach actually banned him from wearing the mask in games, but after a bad injury in 1959, he was allowed to wear it for a little bit. And that little bit turned into an 18-game winning streak, before Plante was forced to take the mask back off and they lost the next one. After dropping the streak, the coach let him keep the mask. Also, another random goalie thing, this was around the time the butterfly was invented, the low-to-the-ground goalie style that everyone uses now. It started with Terry Sawchuk, whose goalie style was him crouching so low that his knees were at his shoulders. To this point, most goalies were usually fully standing, maybe a bit crouched as the puck came close. This guy was doing squats the entire game. Because he was so low to the ground, he could actually see the puck much easier than other goalies. Glenn Hall would take this concept and eventually turn it into the butterfly we know today. Other stuff off the ice includes Hockey Night in Canada officially being created in 1951. It became the highest rated show in Canada the year it started broadcasting on CBC, and in 1956, it was picked up by CBS in America. Eventually, jerseys and ice markings would be changed to help TV audiences follow the games better in black and white. But this wasn't really totally popular with everyone. One notable piece of fallout from this was something that plagued the Chicago Blackhawks for half a century. There was a massive division in the NHL over TV broadcasts because many saw it as a possible replacement for actually attending games. Commissioner Clarence Campbell was actually against Hockey Night. So Arthur Wirtz, the owner of the Chicago Blackhawks, decided that home games would not be broadcast on TV, only on radio. You gotta use your imagination. And during the playoffs, they'd charge fans to go to Chicago Stadium to watch the game through a CCTV. This wasn't just Arthur who'd screw over Hawks fans, but his son Bill continued the tradition by refusing to put home games on television, or at least not until 1992 when he introduced a subscription-based service known as Hawkvision. It cost $30, and even when Hawkvision was dropped just a few years later, those home games remained exclusively through radio until 2007, when Rocky Wirtz finally inherited the team after Dollar Bill's death. Since then, the Hawks have been great, and people in Chicago actually started to care about them because they're on TV. Another random thing that I found funny involving the Blackhawks actually has almost nothing to do with the Hawks. In 1957, Ted and Lindsay attempted to form a players' union after wanting access to player pension records. Conn Smythe called them all commies, and as punishment, the Detroit Red Wings traded Lindsay to the Blackhawks. In fact, pretty much any player that was involved in the creation of the union was sent to the Blackhawks as punishment, which is the most hilarious part of any of this. The union filed an antitrust suit against the NHL, but dropped it after most of the players got spooked about being traded to Chicago and left the union. They did get some small things from the owners, but not much. Eventually, the Players Association was established in 1967 with little pushback from ownership. I think they just didn't like the word union. That's it for the original 6. Let's talk about the expansion era. With added stability in the league combined with the threat of other West Coast leagues developing, the NHL decided to double the teams in 1967. These teams were the Los Angeles Kings, Minnesota North Stars, California Seals, Philadelphia Flyers, Pittsburgh Penguins, and St. Louis Blues. As you can tell, some of these teams didn't last. The North Stars would end up moving to Dallas in the 90s, and the California Golden Seals died in Cleveland. As far as actual play on the ice, the Canadiens and Bruins traded Stanley Cups throughout the 60s and 70s. The expanded rosters created a lot of room for some really forgettable and trash players. Just a flood of bad hockey. But the best teams were top tier, with Bobby Orr and the Bruins and, I guess, the Broad Street Bullies. Also, players started wearing helmets during this time because a guy finally died in 1968. Even more teams showed up in the 70s because of reasons I'll get into later. This was the Vancouver Canucks, Buffalo Sabres, Atlanta Flames, New York Islanders, Kansas City Scouts, and Washington Capitals. The Flames moved to Calgary in 1980, and the Scouts went to Colorado and later became the New Jersey Devils by 1985. The reason why all this extra expansion showed up is because the WHA happened. The World Hockey Association was founded in 1972 by the guys who brought you the ABA in basketball, along with the same petty attitude of Eddie Livingston. They stole a bunch of star players from the NHL and brought them to cities that didn't have NHL teams yet. Guys like Bobby Hull and Gordie Howe, who literally had already retired, he just got tired of wearing a suit. So the NHL expansion was actually calculated to specifically fill stadiums that WHA teams now couldn't play in. That's why the Islanders and Flames existed. Eventually in 1976, both leagues were doing pretty rough, so they talked about merging. And like with their last venture, the WHA's founders agreed to a merger in 1978. This sent the Edmonton Oilers, Hartford Whalers, Quebec Nordiques, and Winnipeg Jets to the NHL, a move that 3 of those teams would not survive. And the only reason the Oilers survived was a single player named Wayne Gretzky. Gretzky is the only reason why there was a probably next to me calling Gordie Howe probably the best hockey player of all time. By the time he was 10, he'd scored 378 goals. By 13, over 1,000 goals. When he was 17, he signed with the WHA because the NHL wouldn't take anyone under 20. So by the time of the merger, he was playing for the Edmonton Oilers, even playing next to his hero in the All-Star game. That hero? Gordie Howe. When the Oilers moved to the NHL, Gretzky's dominance was paired with other players at the top of their game, forming an offense that demolished scoring records. And when I say demolished, I mean there has never been and probably will never be anyone as OP as Gretzky in the game of hockey. He ended his career with 9 MVPs, 15 All-Star appearances, 4 Stanley Cups, and is on top of the all-time goal-scoring leaderboard with a lead of almost 100 goals. And on the all-time assist leaderboard, he's leading by over 700 assists. You want to talk about the most dominant athletes of all time? This is a guy that needs to be in that conversation. Now is as good a time as any to step away from North America and talk about the Red Army. The story goes that hockey came to the Soviet Union when soccer team Dynamo Moscow went to play some friendlies in the UK in 1945 and just happened to see some hockey exhibitions. The next year, a Soviet hockey league was founded, and by 1953, they'd send a team to the World Championships, where they immediately won gold. The Red Army would quickly dominate international hockey. Due to reasons, professionals were not allowed to play in the World Championships or the Olympics, but for other legal reasons, all of the Red Army players were considered amateurs. Many were literally in the actual Red Army or the KGB. This led to Canada dropping out of international play because they saw this as completely unfair to them personally and their storied hockey history, and fully believed that if they were playing with the actual best Canadian players, they could beat the Soviets. So they got a chance in 1972 when an exhibition series was set for a true Canadian national team against the Red Army. And the Red Army still gave them one hell of a fight, leading to actual deserved respect for the team. The only Olympics the Soviet Union didn't get gold at from 1964 onwards was 1980 with the Miracle on Ice, which was, well, a miracle. Anyway, we all know what happened to the Soviet Union as a whole, and when cracks started to form in the country politically, things started moving for Soviet players. When Mikhail Gorbachev took over in the 80s, some NHL teams began essentially placing bets on the possible opening of the country by selecting Soviet players in the NHL draft. They weren't required to come play in the NHL, but teams were holding on to their rights just in case. And some of these players actually heard about being drafted and started defecting to play in the NHL, starting with Alexander Mogilny, who took a plane from Stockholm to defect and play for the Buffalo Sabres. This was followed by actually notable Soviet players, Sergei Fedorov and Vladimir Konstantinov, joining the Detroit Red Wings. Slowly, the Soviet Union began actually allowing hockey players to legally leave the Soviet Union to play in the NHL without defecting. Sergei Piryakin was the first in 1989 after a revolt in the Red Army team led by Vyacheslav Fedosov and Igor Larionov. This led to a fun situation for Fedosov, who was brought in front of the literal Secretary of Defense of the Soviet Union, who threatened to send him to Siberia. But in 1991, the Soviet Union officially fell, opening the floodgates for hockey players from former Soviet states to join NHL teams. The most notable example actually involves quite a few of the players I've already mentioned joining together in Detroit to become the Russian Five, winning the 1997 and 1998 Stanley Cups. Okay, we're hitting the modern era of hockey, so this is the home stretch. I just got a couple more random stories that I need to get to. But first, more expansion. This time, the NHL started looking at hotter climates for some reason. These are teams like the San Jose Sharks, Tampa Bay Lightning, Florida Panthers, Nashville Predators, Atlanta Thrashers, and also the Ottawa Senators are back. I told you they'd be back. And the Minnesota Wild and Columbus Blue Jackets bring hockey back to those respective states who have seen many failed attempts at hockey teams before. Also interesting is they legit decided to name an expansion team after a movie with the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim. I have never seen the Mighty Ducks. Anyway, we're about to hit some turbulence here. Remember the Players Association? Well, here's the 1994 lockout, which happened when the owners wanted to add a salary cap to the league to try to equalize things and cut spending, but the players were worried about their salaries. The NHLPA wanted a luxury tax instead, so it wouldn't cap players' salaries. This was when the Winnipeg Jets and Quebec Nordiques moved to Phoenix and Colorado because the Canadian dollar was doing terribly. And it wasn't just those Canadian WHA teams. The Hartford Whalers moved to Carolina. So it didn't end there. 10 years later, in 2004, it was a bigger and much more pivotal 2004 lockout. It was so long that it canceled the entire 2004 season. Owners had argued that salaries had risen much higher than revenues, and teams were simply going to run out of money before too long. There were some players who were getting stupid money without having even earned those sort of contracts. They wanted a salary cap now. The lockout ended not only with a salary cap added, but a revenue sharing model similarly to the NFL. But players would still be given guaranteed contracts as well as a minimum salary. It took them 310 days to come up with that deal. Some added effects of this lockout were a bit weird. First of all, other sports leagues got some boosts. Notably, MLS was suddenly profitable in 2004, and the CFL and NBA had significant attendance boosts due to there being no hockey. There were also rule changes that I mentioned in my fighting video, like the removal of the two-line pass rule to fix a rapidly declining goal scoring rate in the league, and shutouts were added after a single overtime period for regular season games. Finally, last but not least, I need to talk about Mario Lemieux before I end this video. I personally wouldn't put Lemieux as one of the best ever next to Howe and Gretzky, but he might possibly be the most interesting person in NHL history next to Conn Smythe. Lemieux was drafted by the Pittsburgh Penguins in 1984 and scored on his first ever shot on his first ever shift in the NHL. He was pretty much an instant savior for the Penguins, spending the late 80s dragging them into relevance by himself and winning the Stanley Cup in 1991 and 1992. Then in 1993, he announced that he had cancer. Actually, Lemieux was plagued by injuries throughout his career, but getting cancer while at the top of his game is something almost completely unheard of. But somehow, this was only a minor setback for him. He missed 2 months for radiation therapy, and when he came back, he was behind the lead in goals by 12, but he would finish the season back on top of that leaderboard. In 1997, his other injuries caught up to him, and he decided to retire, immediately being inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. Then, things get weird. The Penguins had overcommitted too much money to players over the years, owing over $90 million. So they had to declare for bankruptcy and were being faced with either leaving Pittsburgh or folding. But Mario over here decides to propose a different solution. He says that he should be able to use the debt owed to him, totaling to around $32.5 million, and turn that debt into equity in the team. Basically, he would buy the team by using the debt owed to him. And a debt of that amount would make him the majority owner of the team automatically. And somehow this worked. The bankruptcy court said this sounded about right, and Lemieux became the first former player to own a team and somehow found a way to settle all of the debts against the team. And we're not done yet, because after all of this, Mario Lemieux decided that in 2000, he, an NHL owner and literal Hall of Famer who has already been inducted into the Hall of Fame, would come out of retirement to play for the Penguins. He said the only reason was because his son never got to watch him play hockey. And somehow he was still really good. He was named a finalist for MVP and made an all-star appearance that season. He even finally got to live his dream of playing in and winning gold in the Olympics in 2002. He missed a lot of games, but his efficiency was through the roof, and by the time he finally retired a second time in 2006, he had the highest points per game in each season since his return. To recap, a guy literally dragged a team out of the mud, won championships for that team, got cancer while playing at his peak, beat cancer, and continued playing at the same high level, retired, used the weirdest bankruptcy law to buy the team and save it from bankruptcy and collapse, and then came back to the game just so he could have some fun with his kid, all while somehow dominating whenever he made it onto the ice. I need a full docuseries of just this. Way better than The Last Dance. And that's pretty much it at this point. Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin started dominating in the league. They're still playing, actually. The Chicago Blackhawks dynasty, led by new owner Rocky Wirtz, came and went, along with Crosby's Penguins and the LA Kings. Also, there's outdoor games now, so that's fun. And also the Atlanta Thrashers, after winning one Stanley Cup, moved to Winnipeg to bring back the Jets. And then there's a brand new bit of expansion recently with the Las Vegas Golden Knights joining a few years ago and the Seattle Kraken set to join later in 2021. Ever since I found out about hockey, I've always been fairly interested in it, but because I grew up in Chicago where there was still the broadcast embargo, I didn't really discover it until I was a bit older. And I've also had trouble finding good hockey documentaries in the same way I'm able to find NFL, MLB, and NBA documentaries. So this whole experience was really fun for me. I think that we've all learned quite a bit around here. Thank you for watching. I have a Patreon that has added a third patron recently, but he's not visible here. I'd like these slots filled someday. I really need a like and subscribe and some interaction to tell the algorithm that I'm a good girl, and maybe even share this video to someone else who doesn't know about the history of hockey because it's really fun. Also, I hit 50 subscribers, so that's neat. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week with some anime titties.